In the winter of 1941, the world was holding its breath. The Allies had been battered across Europe, and Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine. But hidden behind the calm facades of English coastal towns, a new kind of soldier was being forged. Men trained not to hold the line, but to strike from the shadows. Their mission was simple in words but deadly in execution: raid, destroy, vanish. These were the Commandos. Operation Archery, planned for the remote Norwegian port of Vagsøy, was to be one of their first major tests. The objective: cripple German facilities supplying vital fish oil, a key ingredient in explosives production, and inflict enough damage to force the Wehrmacht to divert troops from the Eastern Front. Yet behind the official orders lay another goal: to show that Britain could still hit back. Throughout December 1941, No. 3 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford-Slater, trained relentlessly in the Scottish Highlands. They were joined by elements of No. 2 and No. 4 Commando, Royal Engineers, and small detachments from the Royal Norwegian Army, men who knew the terrain and longed to strike at their occupiers. Every day brought drills, mock assaults, and live-fire exercises. They practiced beach landings in icy surf and fought through replica Norwegian villages built from scrap wood and barbed wire. The men wore standard-issue green battle dress, with white camouflage smocks hastily sewn from bedsheets. Their weapons, Lee Enfield rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Bren light machine guns, and Mills bombs, were meticulously oiled and checked each night. Every man must be able to fight as a soldier, think as an officer, and disappear as a ghost, Durnford-Slater told them before departure. It was a motto that would later haunt the records of Operation Archery. On Christmas Eve, 1941, the Commandos boarded their transports at Scapa Flow under strict secrecy. The fleet included the cruiser HMS Kenya, destroyers HMS Onslow and HMS Oribi, and several landing craft packed with men and supplies. RAF aircraft stood ready to provide cover, though weather over the North Sea was worsening by the hour. A blizzard rolled in, forcing the flotilla to delay departure until Christmas night. Some men joked darkly that even the weather feared the Germans. As they sailed, the reality of their mission set in. Vagsøy was heavily defended. German troops, coastal batteries, and machine gun nests commanded the fjord approaches. Intelligence estimated 150 to 200 defenders, but later reports would reveal closer to 400. Still, morale was high. The Commandos sang "Roll Out the Barrel" on deck, their laughter echoing against the steel hulls. Beneath the bravado, though, they knew that one wrong move could turn the raid into a massacre. Durnford-Slater wrote in his diary, "We were going to war in miniature, but no less deadly. Each man's courage would be the difference between success and oblivion." His words capture the fragile balance of their mission, the fine line between daring and disaster. At Combined Operations HQ in London, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, newly appointed to oversee these raids, watched the operation unfold through coded radio updates. For him, this was more than just a strike. It was a signal to friend and foe alike that Britain still had fight left in her veins. Churchill's earlier directive rang clear in his mind: "Set Europe ablaze." By the time the fleet neared the Norwegian coast on December 26, snow flurries and heavy seas battered the landing craft. The fjords loomed like black walls in the night, and the men huddled in silence, their breath forming frost inside their helmets. The Norwegian guides pointed out faint lights on shore. German positions, perhaps, or civilian homes that had survived occupation under the iron fist of the Reich. Inside one of the troop carriers, Sergeant Bill Milner of No. 3 Commando checked his gear again, tightening the strap on his Bren gun. He looked at the photograph of his wife tucked inside his jacket and whispered, "See you soon, love." It was the kind of quiet ritual repeated across dozens of faces, men masking fear with focus. As the clock neared dawn, final briefings were whispered under dim red lights. Maps were passed hand to hand, showing landing beaches marked with codenames red, green, and white. Demolition teams were assigned to destroy oil tanks, factories, and communication cables. Snipers and covering fire teams rehearsed their sequences in low voices. The Royal Navy gunners readied their 4-inch guns for bombardment. At 8:48 a.m., the fleet reached its designated position. Engines idled. The wind howled. Durnford Slater stood at the bow of his landing craft, binoculars raised. Ahead lay Vagsoy, a small fishing port about to become the stage for one of the most daring commando raids of the war. He turned to his men and said simply, "Gentlemen, the eyes of Britain are upon you." It was then, as the first light touched the snow-covered cliffs, that a strange silence seemed to fall. No one spoke. No one moved. For a heartbeat, even the sea held its breath. Then, with a wave of Durnford Slater's arm, the engines roared to life, and the first wave of commandos surged toward shore. What none of them could know was that among the official orders, the ones to burn factories and cut cables, a sealed envelope carried a different instruction, marked only for senior eyes. Inside was a handwritten note, secondary objective, intelligence retrieval, priority red, details classified. That order, never entered in the main war diary, would soon intertwine with the fate of several men whose names would later vanish from the records entirely. The morning of December 27, 1941, dawned gray and bitterly cold over the Norwegian coast. The snow-clad cliffs of Vagsoy loomed through the mist as the Royal Navy's bombardment began. Shells from HMS Kenya screamed overhead, slamming into German gun emplacements on the hillsides. Within moments, the stillness shattered. Smoke, fire, and chaos filled the air. This was the beginning of Operation Archery's assault phase, a battle fought in the narrow streets and frozen docks of a small port that had suddenly become the front line of Europe. As the first landing craft scraped against the rocky shore, commandos leapt into knee-deep water, rifles raised, snow swirling around them. No. 3 Commando led the charge on Malloy, while supporting units secured the flanking villages of Nord-Vagsoy and Sør-Vagsoy. German defenders, mostly troops from the 181st Infantry Division, were ready. Machine guns opened from windows and rooftops, cutting through the surf as British soldiers scrambled for cover. Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater later recalled in his journal, "The enemy was waiting for us. They had excellent fields of fire. Every street was a battlefield, every doorway a fortress." His words capture the ferocity of what followed. The commandos fought house to house, clearing rooms with grenades and Thompson submachine guns. Smoke grenades filled the narrow lanes, masking their movements as sniper fire cracked from the church tower overlooking the harbor. Captain Jack Churchill, no relation to the Prime Minister but every bit as daring, was among the officers leading the charge. Known for carrying a Scottish claymore into battle, he reportedly shouted encouragement to his men above the din. "Let's give them a proper Highland welcome." His boldness became legend, but few saw the grim toll mounting as commandos fell one by one in the snow. By mid-morning, the fight had devolved into brutal street combat. German troops retreated into cellars and warehouses, forcing the British to clear them by hand. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, huddled in basements, praying the nightmare would pass. Explosions rocked the port as demolition teams set charges on oil tanks and factory buildings. Flames lit up the harbor, and black smoke rose high into the sky, a signal visible miles out to sea. Amid the chaos, a small group from the Royal Engineers slipped away from the main assault toward a building marked on their maps as a communications post. Their task: cut German telephone lines and seize any documents or equipment left behind. It was a standard procedure, or so it seemed. Yet witnesses later noted that one of the engineers carried an extra satchel, sealed and marked "Confidential, Combined Ops." When asked about it after the war, surviving members said only that it contained signals material. None could say where it went. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, a young commando named Private Tom Evans was pinned behind a stone wall with his section. He later wrote in a letter home, "The snow was red, and the air smelled of cordite and fish oil. I remember thinking this was supposed to be a raid, not a war." His section eventually broke through and joined the main body, but several men were missing, including 2 from the demolition squad assigned to the fish oil plant. No one could say when or where they disappeared. By noon, the commandos had control of most of Vagsoy. The Royal Navy's guns silenced remaining defenses, and the Royal Air Force strafed retreating German units along the fjord. With the town secured, Durnford Slater signaled HMS Kenya, objective achieved. Preparing withdrawal. But even as British victory seemed assured, a growing unease spread among the officers. Roll calls revealed discrepancies, men unaccounted for, equipment missing, and a small boat seen leaving the harbor without orders. Major Anders Larsson of the Norwegian contingent approached Durnfordslater with troubling news. Local resistance contacts reported a German signal station just outside the operational boundary, something not listed on their original intelligence maps. He requested permission to send a patrol to investigate. Durnfordslater hesitated, then shook his head. "Orders are clear. We don't overreach." Still, as Larsson left, he noticed the lieutenant colonel quietly pass a folded paper to a Royal Engineer officer. Moments later, a small detachment moved out toward the North Ridge, their movements unrecorded in the official war diary. By late afternoon, German reinforcements began arriving from the mainland. The Luftwaffe launched counterattacks on the Royal Navy ships offshore. HMS Kenya and HMS Onslow responded with heavy anti-aircraft fire as bombs splashed into the freezing waters around them. The evacuation order was given. Commandos began pulling back to the beaches under cover of smoke and naval gunfire. Those who could still run carried their wounded comrades, while the dead were left where they fell. As the last landing craft pushed off from shore, Durnfordslater scanned the smoke-covered coastline through his binoculars. "All accounted for?" he asked his adjutant. The man nodded, hesitated, and said quietly, "Almost, sir." Durnfordslater didn't respond. He turned back to the gray horizon, the sound of engines drowning out his thoughts. In the chaos of war, almost was sometimes good enough. But for Operation Archery, it marked the beginning of a mystery that would outlast the battle itself. Somewhere amid the ruins of Vagsoy, a handful of men had vanished, along with whatever secret orders they'd been carrying. By the time HMS Kenya and her escort ships cleared the Norwegian coastline, the smoke of Vagsoy was still visible against the gray horizon. The raid had lasted only a few hours, but its echoes were already rippling through the Allied command. Official reports spoke of success, factories destroyed, German casualties heavy, and British morale boosted. Yet, among those who had fought in the narrow streets of Malloy, there lingered a sense that not everything had gone according to plan. In the lower decks of HMS Oreby, wounded commandos lay in silence, their faces pale beneath dim lantern light. Some whispered about the missing demolition team from the fish oil plant, 5 men last seen near the waterfront, their radio gone silent mid-transmission. The ship's radio operator logged repeated attempts to reach them, each met with static. The names of the missing were quietly left off the first after-action report, replaced by the vague phrase, "unaccounted for, presumed lost." Durnfordslater, ever meticulous, reviewed the battle logs that evening. Something didn't sit right. Among the captured German documents, one stood out, a weathered folder marked Kriegsmarine, Signalverkehr Bergenflot. It contained coded entries, naval cipher keys, and references to convoy routes along the Norwegian coast, information far beyond what would be expected in a coastal garrison. When he presented it to the intelligence officer aboard HMS Kenya, the man's reaction was immediate. He sealed the folder, marked it top secret, and ordered it transferred directly to the Admiralty's cryptographic section at Bletchley Park. "You found something far more valuable than fish oil," he told Durnfordslater. But the folder wasn't the only discovery. Royal engineers who had searched the communication post earlier reported finding German radio components, and an unusual steel case half buried in snow outside the building. When they tried to retrieve it, a nearby ammunition store exploded, forcing them to withdraw. Later inspection revealed that the blast had been precise, almost controlled, as if triggered deliberately to prevent the case's capture. And among the debris, an empty British webbing pouch was found. Stenciled faintly inside was a serial number matching one of the missing commandos. Rumors spread through the fleet during the return voyage to Scotland. Some said the missing men had been captured and executed by the Germans. Others believed they had slipped inland with Norwegian partisans to complete a secret task. But no one could explain why their names were missing from every radio log and operational return. It was as if they had been erased, administratively vanished. When the ships docked at Scapa Flow, the returning heroes were greeted with cheers, photographers, and Churchill's personal message of congratulations. "The skill and daring of the Commandos at WWII," he wrote, "will echo through the enemy's lines and into the hearts of free men everywhere." Behind the speeches and medals, however, Durnford-Slater filed a confidential memo to Combined Operations noting the disappearance of 5 personnel under unexplained circumstances. The memo was acknowledged, and then quietly reclassified. In later interviews, several officers hinted at the presence of another element aboard the flotilla, a small group not part of the standard commando structure. Their uniforms bore no insignia, and their orders came from outside Combined Operations. They had trained separately, embarked last, and disembarked first. According to one sailor's diary, they carried unusual crates labeled Wireless Experimental Unit. The diary ends abruptly 2 days after the raid, the remaining pages torn out. Post-war researchers found traces of this in Admiralty correspondence. In a memo dated January 1942, Rear Admiral Charles Kennedy Purvis wrote, "Concerning the WWII raid, all references to the Special Detachment are to be removed from the public record. Liaise with MI6 Liaison, Section D." Section D was the precursor to the Special Operations Executive, the very branch responsible for clandestine missions across occupied Europe. For decades, this connection remained buried. But in the 1970s, a partially declassified file, ADM 22317, surfaced in the National Archives. Inside were fragments of orders referring to a parallel mission under Operation Archery, codenamed Frostbite. Its stated goal, seizure of enemy cryptographic materials and transmission equipment, believed present at WWII Signal Station. Personnel, classified. Outcome, incomplete. No personnel list was attached. The disappearance of the 5 commandos, once dismissed as battlefield chaos, suddenly appeared in a different light. Had they been part of Frostbite, a mission concealed even from their own comrades? And if so, what had they found in that snow-covered signal hut that was worth their erasure from history? As one historian later wrote, Operation Archery was a success measured in explosions and headlines. But somewhere between the burning docks and the silent fjords, another war was being fought, a war of secrecy, where victory was never announced, and those who achieved it were never named. When Durnford-Slater's personal effects were catalogued after his death, a single note was found among his papers. In neat handwriting, it read, "5 went ashore. 4 never came back. 1 was seen north of the ridge at dusk. No trace since." The note was unsigned, undated, and unlike the rest of his official writings, it bore a faint watermark, the emblem of the Secret Intelligence Service. As dusk fell over the Norwegian Sea on December 27, 1941, the battered convoy of British warships began its withdrawal. The roar of the guns faded behind them, replaced by the relentless hiss of wind and waves. For the men aboard, the adrenaline of battle was ebbing, replaced by exhaustion, relief, and, for some, unease. Victory had been declared. But a strange silence lingered over the decks, broken only by the distant hum of the engines and the creak of steel in the cold. Lieutenant Colonel Durnford-Slater stood alone on the bridge of HMS Kenya, reviewing the situation reports. Officially, the operation had been a success. They had killed or captured hundreds of German soldiers, destroyed key installations, and withdrawn with relatively light casualties. But unofficially, something was wrong. 5 men from the demolition and engineering units were still unaccounted for. The numbers didn't add up, and neither did the stories. The confusion had begun even before the last landing craft left WWII. According to the Beachmaster's report, one of the final craft to launch had carried an unauthorized detachment of 5 men, seen moving north of the main beach toward the cliffs. When naval gunfire resumed, the craft had vanished from sight. Some witnesses claimed to have seen muzzle flashes from the ridge. Perhaps the men were covering the withdrawal. Others insisted there were no British troops in that sector at all. The war diary entry for that hour was later redacted in the official copy sent to the Admiralty. At sea, radio contact with shore parties had been intermittent, garbled by interference and jamming. One transmission stood out, a short, broken message received by HMS Oribi at 14:37 hours. Package located, resistance heavy, proceeding to, then silence. When replayed days later, Engineers noted that the message included faint secondary tones, as if another transmitter had been broadcasting nearby on the same frequency. Some speculated it was German jamming. Others quietly wondered if it had been something else entirely. The Royal Navy convoy didn't linger. The Luftwaffe struck hard as night fell, launching several waves of bombers from Stavanger and Herdla airfields. HMS Kenya's anti-aircraft guns thundered into the darkness, tracers lighting the sky like falling stars. One near miss rocked the ship, shattering portholes and dousing the deck in icy spray. The Commandos huddled below, praying the storm and darkness would protect them. It did, barely. By dawn, the skies were clear, and the surviving ships were speeding west toward home. Back in Britain, the euphoria of success drowned out lingering doubts. The newspapers hailed the WWII raid as a triumph of British courage and ingenuity. Photographs of returning commandos were splashed across the front pages, young men grinning beneath steel helmets, waving to the crowds at Greenock. No mention was made of the missing. Their names never appeared in the casualty rolls, nor were letters sent to their families. Officially, they had never existed. Privately, Durnford Slater pressed for answers. He requested a post-action inquiry, citing the missing demolition team and the secondary intelligence objective. The response came from Combined Operations HQ, matter closed. No further inquiry warranted. Focus on future operations. The memo was signed not by Mountbatten, but by an official whose name was blacked out in the surviving copy. In Norway, locals in WWII began to whisper of strange events after the raid. A fisherman claimed to have seen British soldiers captured near the North Ridge by German patrols. Another insisted he had found a scorched rubber boot and fragments of webbing washed up along the fjord days later. German records recovered after the war mention a brief skirmish north of Malloy and the capture of enemy personnel, but no follow-up reports exist. One entry, however, was more revealing. Dated December 30, 1941, it noted, "One prisoner transferred to Bergen under SS escort, per orders of Abwerstel Hamburg. Subject: Special interest." The prisoner's name was not listed. When Allied intelligence reviewed the German files after 1945, the entry was flagged, but the associated prisoner transfer records were missing. It was as if they had been removed long before the war's end. Some historians later speculated that one of the missing commandos had indeed been taken alive, perhaps attempting to exfiltrate sensitive material. If true, that man vanished into the same shadowy network of intelligence operations that would later define the Cold War. The rest of the commando force moved on. Within months, many veterans of archery were redeployed to North Africa and Dieppe. They rarely spoke of WWII again. Those who did remembered flashes, snow, fire, and the eerie silence that followed the shooting. "It was over too fast," one survivor said in a 1980 interview. "But I swear, as we pulled away, I saw movement on that ridge. A figure waving something white. Could have been one of ours. Could have been a trick of the light. But I've never forgotten it." That image, a lone man on a frozen ridge, signaling to a fleet that would never return, became a haunting metaphor for Operation Archery. A symbol of both courage and the secrecy that surrounded it. For while Britain celebrated its textbook commando raid, something else had unfolded beneath the surface, an operation whose traces were wiped clean, leaving behind only fragments and rumors. And somewhere in those frozen fjords, perhaps under snow and time, the truth of what happened to the missing men waited in silence, beyond reach, but never entirely forgotten. For 3 decades, Operation Archery remained one of Britain's most celebrated early commando raids, a story of precision, daring, and victory against impossible odds. Yet behind the official history, buried in classified archives and footnotes, another narrative quietly took shape. It began to surface in the early 1970s, when historians and researchers gained limited access to declassified documents from the Ministry of Defense. Among them was a thin folder labeled simply, "Archery, Supplementary Material, Restricted." Inside were a handful of pages, heavily redacted. But one phrase stood out in clear type: MI6 submission, Frostbite, WWII region. Objective: recovery of German signal intelligence equipment. Beneath it, a single notation read, "Operational outcome unknown." It was the first official hint that Operation Archery had carried a secret agenda beyond the destruction of factories and morale. Researchers traced the reference to a parallel communication between Combined Operations HQ and the Secret Intelligence Service. A cable dated December 20, 1941, instructed an MI6 liaison team to attach to No. 3 Commando in advisory capacity and to prepare special measures in case of equipment compromise. What this meant wasn't clear, but an internal report from 1942 added another piece to the puzzle. One wireless set of non-standard origin missing in action, presumed destroyed in Norway. One of those researchers, military historian Michael Asher, later described his reaction in an interview. It was obvious something had been airbrushed out. The more I read, the clearer it became that Frostbite wasn't just an intelligence-gathering add-on. It was the real reason for the raid. Evidence suggested that the Germans had installed a small but advanced naval signal intercept station near Vagsøy, possibly linked to the Kriegsmarine's U-boat command network. Capturing its equipment could have provided priceless insight into the Enigma encrypted communications between German submarines and Coastal Command. The Royal Navy had been desperate for such a breakthrough, especially as the Battle of the Atlantic was turning against them. Every convoy lost meant hundreds of lives and tons of vital supplies gone to the ocean floor. The Frostbite team, according to fragments of MI6 correspondence, was composed of just 5 men, 2 Royal Engineers, 1 linguist from Bletchley Park, and 2 field specialists. Their task was to infiltrate the signal post during the chaos of the raid, extract its cryptographic materials, and return to the extraction point under cover of the main withdrawal. It was an audacious plan, and one kept secret even from the commandos they fought alongside. But something had gone wrong. The intercepted transmission from Vagsøy, the one that ended mid-sentence, package located, resistance heavy, matched Frostbite's expected call sign. The package, many now believe, referred not to documents but to a piece of Enigma-related equipment. If true, it meant the team had succeeded in part of their mission before being cut off. Declassified minutes from a 1942 Admiralty meeting provided a chilling clue. Material from Vagsøy, incomplete, of limited use. Recovery, uncertain. Further discussion, unnecessary. Subject closed. No reference to personnel. No acknowledgement of losses. Only silence. Years later, in 1978, a retired Norwegian fisherman named Olav Erdal made an unexpected discovery near Malloy. While repairing his nets along a rocky stretch north of the town, he found a corroded metal case wedged in the shallows. Inside were fragments of radio dials, a rusted hand crank generator, and a scrap of oilcloth bearing the faintly stenciled letters SOE. The British government requested its immediate return through diplomatic channels, citing sensitive historical value. It was quietly taken to the UK and never displayed. In the same year, British defense records confirmed that Operation Frostbite was officially downgraded from top secret to restricted access, though its personnel list remained classified. When journalists requested clarification, a Ministry of Defense spokesperson replied, "No comment on intelligence matters related to wartime operations." What happened to the 5 men remains officially unknown. One plausible theory suggests they reached the signal post, retrieved parts of the German cipher machine, and attempted to exfiltrate via the northern ridge, the very area from which Durnford-Slater's men reported seeing movement during the withdrawal. If they were intercepted by German patrols, their capture would have been catastrophic. MI6 may have chosen to erase their existence entirely rather than risk revealing the mission. It is this possibility that gives Frostbite its enduring mystery and its quiet tragedy. Those men were not only commandos but pioneers of Britain's wartime intelligence war, fighting battles no one could ever publicly acknowledge. Their success or failure, hidden in sealed archives, might have altered the course of the Atlantic campaign in ways historians can only guess. As Asher wrote in his 1982 book The Silent Raids, history remembers the explosions, not the silences that followed them. But sometimes the silences hide the truth. The missions erased not because they failed, but because they mattered too much. And so, in the official roll of Operation Archery's heroes, there are no names from Frostbite. No medals, no graves, no public record. Only an unmarked gap in the story. and the faint possibility that somewhere in the freezing chaos of that December morning, Britain's secret war left its truest heroes behind. 80 years after the guns fell silent over Vagsøy, the echoes of Operation Archery still linger in the Norwegian fjords. The town has rebuilt, its harbor now a peaceful inlet lined with red-painted boathouses and fishing trawlers. Tourists come and go, unaware that beneath their feet, the snow once ran black with smoke and flame. Yet for a small circle of historians, divers, and local researchers, the past refuses to rest. In 2021, a discovery in those same cold waters would reignite one of the war's most persistent mysteries, the fate of the lost British Commandos. The find came by chance. A team of Norwegian marine archaeologists conducting sonar surveys near Moløy detected a series of metallic anomalies beneath the seabed, just north of the main harbor. Divers soon recovered a collection of corroded objects, fragments of British webbing, a rusted commando knife, and the unmistakable remains of a portable radio transmitter, bearing the faded inscription property of War Office, 1941. More telling still, a cloth patch, the red dagger insignia of the British Commandos, was preserved inside a fragment of oilskin. Local newspapers ran the story under the headline, "World War II Relic Discovery May Rewrite Vagsøy Raid." Within days, British defense officials quietly contacted the Norwegian authorities to arrange the item's transfer to London. No public statement followed. The recovered artifacts vanished into government custody, just as they had in 1978. But Norwegian historian Ingrid Stolen, who photographed the items before their removal, noticed something unusual. One metal tag bore faint, engraved initials, RM, the same initials recorded for sapper Ronald Mears, a Royal Engineer listed in the 1941 embarkation roster but absent from all post-war commando records. When she cross-referenced Mears' file, she found it incomplete, missing pages between December 1941 and January 1942. It was as if the Ministry of Defense had lifted his name out of history itself. Stolen's findings sparked renewed investigation by British military archivists. In 2022, a small section of documents was released under the UK's 80-year rule. Among them was a memo written by Admiral Louis Mountbatten in early 1942, regarding Vagsøy Special Detachment, commend their bravery but omit reference from Combined Ops Report. Security priority, above recognition. It confirmed what many had long suspected, that a secret submission, Frostbite, had indeed taken place under the cover of Operation Archery, and that its participants had been deliberately erased to protect intelligence operations still active at war's end. Even more revealing was a follow-up file, marked, Closed, 1957. It described the post-war analysis of equipment fragments recovered from Norwegian coast, consistent with modified Enigma relay unit, experimental type. The notation at the bottom read, Origin, Vagsøy, 1941. No further action. For historians, this was a revelation. It meant that the missing commandos may have accomplished what they set out to do, recover part of the Enigma network before vanishing in the chaos of the withdrawal. Their success, buried beneath secrecy, may have quietly contributed to the Allies' eventual victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The human story, however, remained unresolved. Families of the missing men, now several generations removed, began reaching out after the 2021 discovery. One granddaughter of Corporal Peter Haynes told the BBC, "My father always said his dad went on a raid that never happened. Now I know why. He wasn't forgotten. He was hidden." Today, a small memorial stands near the Vagsøy coastline. It lists the names of all British and Norwegian personnel who took part in Operation Archery, save for the 5 who vanished. Yet every December, a local fisherman named Lars Vik places a wreath by the rocks where the radio was found. He says his grandfather once saw lights on the ridge during that terrible morning in 1941, 5 flashes, then darkness. For the British Archives, the case of Operation Frostbite remains officially closed. The files are sealed until 2045. Until then, speculation and silence will fill the gaps that history refuses to explain. Perhaps that's fitting. In a war defined by secrecy, deception, and sacrifice, not every victory was meant to be known. Some remained buried in ice and code, remembered only by the wind that still howls across the Norwegian fjords. Operation Archery will always be remembered as the raid that proved Britain could strike back, but in the shadows of that triumph lies another truth, that some men fought and died for a secret so vital, their very existence had to be erased. Their story, once forgotten, now resurfaces not as legend, but as a quiet reminder that history's loudest moments are often written by those who were never meant to be seen.